But the school also emphasizes other stories that we argue the Modjeska Simkins School are incredibly important to understanding what South Carolina is like in the year 2025. So we actually start with indigenous histories in South Carolina, histories that are often ignored or downplayed. Tribes like the Catawba Nation or the Yamasee tribe, talking about the early period of colonization in South Carolina. I actually don't start with Charlestown. I actually go back to 1526 and some of the evidence of Spanish colonization attempts in what is now South Carolina. But I also try to work our way through the history of South Carolina from different perspectives. From example, the points of view of enslaved Africans who were fighting for their freedom in the Stolen Rebellion of 1739. Looking at the Revolutionary War from the point of view of poor whites in South Carolina during that time period. After all, next year is the 250th anniversary of the Revolutionary War, the Declaration of Independence, and all of that. And of course, as many of you might know, there were more battles fought in this state than anywhere else in the 13 colonies. And so I'm looking forward to seeing how the 250th Commission handles that here in South Carolina. But I think it's especially important for all of us working, whether it's K-12 or it's at the college university level, to really emphasize to our students the importance of the Revolutionary Era. And I emphasize the word revolutionary. Now, in a few days, Ken Burns' documentary, American Revolution, will begin airing on PBS. As a self-professed nerd, I cannot wait. My popcorn is already ready. But I've been reading a lot about how Ken Burns and his team did that particular project. And they're going to really emphasize the messiness of the revolution. When I was a kid and I learned about the Revolutionary War or the American Civil War, it was always presented in terms of soldiers in red coats versus soldiers in blue coats in the Revolutionary War. Or the Civil War, it was soldiers in blue versus soldiers in gray. That's all we learned about. But my approach to the Modjeska Simkins School is that events like warfare, economic depression, political strife and turmoil, all of these things are far, far more complicated if we present them in a more nonpartisan, more truthful fashion. For example, the American Civil War. Just yesterday, I spent some time at Claflin teaching my students about the ordinances of secession and how to actually read those, understand them for the evidence they present in terms of explaining why the Confederate States left the Union. I emphasize that because when I was a child growing up in 1990s Georgia, I was taught, depending on the grade level, that the Civil War was either about states' rights or about slavery. One year it was states' rights, next year it was about slavery. The year after that it was states' rights again, next year it was some weird combination of the two. And at the same time, in Georgia in the 1990s, in case you don't know, we were having a big debate about our state flag, which included a part of the Confederate flag in it. But when I would go home, and I would talk to my parents about history, especially African American history, my dad would always say, son, never forget, no matter what they tell you in school, the Civil War was about slavery. My grandmother gave me her 3 ebony pictorial history of Black America books that she purchased in 1971. She gave them to me when I was 6 years old. She said I should keep these. I thought to myself, well, these are your books. I can't take your books. She said, no, you're the only person who comes to my house and actually reads them. You should keep them. I still have them to this day. And in those books, they say the Civil War was about slavery. So from a young age, I was learning that even history, the history that my teachers were teaching me, was very complicated. And it wasn't simply a question of, this is what's in the textbook, so it has to be correct. In both the Modjeska Simkins School and at Claflin University, I try to emphasize to my students, no matter how old or young they are, that it's never too late as a concerned citizen, as a concerned student, to learn a new thing or two about history and to apply that knowledge to the here and now. It's actually kind of advantageous that I'm doing this talk today. Yesterday, I just spent some time talking with my students about the following things. This is a typical day of teaching history in Claflin. 8 a.m., I'm talking about the causes of the American Civil War. 9:30 a.m., I'm talking about the Selma to Montgomery campaign, the Voting Rights Act. At 2 o'clock, I'm talking about the first 20 years of the history of the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany's rise in the 1930s. 3:30, I'm talking to students about their thesis presentations. As you can see, there is a reason why most historians at conferences and events go to the bar as soon as they possibly can. In fact, I'm an outlier. I don't really drink much at all, and most of my colleagues worry about me. But the point here is that in every single class, I didn't just lecture to students. I showed them where I took my evidence from, where my evidence came from. I presented them with arguments about history. And the same is true of the Modjeska Simkins School. In that course, I'm not only showing folks images from history, I'm showing the actual documents. We're reading documents together. We have a wonderful reading list in that school as well, where students are really encouraged to read outside of class. I've had some students who will take the extraordinary step of printing off every single document posted online for the school, and they're having these really thick binders. And I'm saying, you might not have to kill too many trees. You can PDF some of those and save them to a hard drive somewhere. But the important thing here is that when we talk about the nonpartisan nature of truth, it's not just a question of trying to stay above the fray, politically speaking. I would actually argue it's doing the reverse. It's actually getting into the fray, but saying that if you are going to be involved in the fray as a concerned citizen, as an activist, as a social justice advocate, or simply as someone who is a curious and engaged citizen, you need to at least have the tools with which to understand that history that you're talking about. And at the same time, you should also preserve those tools to talk about new and different kinds of histories as well. When I teach at Claflin, one of my favorite pastimes is to talk about the history of Claflin vis-a-vis a variety of images from the 20th and 21st centuries. Most of our students at Claflin are, in fact, from the state of South Carolina. Some of them had parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, who also went to Claflin. In fact, a few weeks ago, one of our students tragically passed away a month before graduation, and he was actually a fourth-generation Claflin student. We have faculty at Claflin who had gone to Claflin who had his grandparents as faculty decades ago. And so at Claflin, as I tell my students, that history is all around us. But what's also important to note about the history of Claflin is that it is in many ways a microcosm of history in South Carolina. Oftentimes in grand narratives of, say, American history or Southern history even, South Carolina is kind of left out or downplayed. It doesn't have some of the great visuals of civil rights era from, say, Alabama, or some of those more boisterous figures like Huey Long from Louisiana. But what South Carolina does have is the intellectual base of both modern conservatism in many ways, and also modern radicalism. Conservatism, of course, talk about John C. Calhoun, his ideas about states' rights, and what we now call interposition. You have Ben Tillman, his arguments of xenophobia and racism. James Burns, his importance, beginnings of the Cold War era. And of course, everyone's good and dear friend, Strom Thurmond, who was actually, a really pivotal figure in southern states becoming more and more Republican during and after his lifetime. But I also point out to students that South Carolina has a long tradition of radicalism. I mentioned the rebel at Stono. We have Denmark Vesey. We have Robert Smalls. We also have Robert Elliott, another congressman from South Carolina who I think is kind of downplayed, but Robert Elliott's story is extraordinary. He goes to Congress in the 1870s and actually debates Alexander Stephens over the Civil Rights Bill of 1875. Mm-hmm. Stephens, by the way, was the former vice president of the Confederacy, and to my everlasting shame as a native Georgian, a congressman from Georgia. Mm-hmm. But Eliot made the argument the Civil Rights Act of 1875 is integral because it was meant to support Black men and women who stood by the Union, but many others did not during and after the American Civil War. Likewise, Claflin is an example of this history as well. Now, I was going to show some images of this, but as you can see, the projector is not existent in this room. But instead, what I want to emphasize is that if you go to the Library of Congress's website, if you type in Orangeburg or Claflin University, the first images you will come across were images taken by a team of African-American scholars led by W.E.B. Du Bois, who in 1900 presented in Paris, France, what they referred to as the Negro American Exposition. Now, one of these images, see, there it is right here. You might not be able to see this from where you are, but I just have to show this one picture real quick. This is an image of what was our main building in 1899. And I often show this to students at Claflin because of not the building in the background, which unfortunately burned down a few years later under mysterious circumstances, but the people in the foreground. People in the foreground, some of whom may have been born into slavery, many of whom were born after the slavery. They were the first generation of Black men and women in South Carolina to be born free from the chains of oppression, at least of slavery. But these folks were also dealing with Jim Crow segregation. They were also dealing with war with Spain the previous year. They were dealing with a world in which the dreams of their fathers and mothers seemed to be teetering on the brink of destruction. But I also emphasize to my students, perhaps the most important reason you all should learn this history is for their sakes. It is, after all, their stories that we also tell at Claflin, the Modjeska Simkins School. The folks who did not leave behind voluminous records or wrote the great books of history. Instead, everyday men and women lived, worked, loved, died, hoping for a better tomorrow. Oftentimes, these are the folks who are left out of the main narrative of history. But I think if we want a more nonpartisan, truthful history, and by the way, a history that everyone will actually enjoy, cherish, and care about, these are the people we have to emphasize. So-called everyday people, men and women who solved the earth. Ultimately, they are the ones who are the engaged citizens, the activists, the freedom fighters, the folks that history doesn't glamorize, but without them, history never takes a new turn. So this nonpartisan nature of history, this nonpartisan nature of truth is important to what we do as historians, scholars, educators, but above all, I would argue, this nonpartisan nature of truth is important to who we are as citizens. In the United States right now, there is a conflict, cultural, intellectual conflict, over who we are as a people, as an American. This is not a new conflict, but it's different this time because of the stakes. One hopes that we can start the process of having a true, unvarnished history of our nation, of our state, of our local communities. This history won't always be positive. It won't always be uplifting, but it must always be true. My hope today is that perhaps you've taken a kernel of this information, a kernel of thought, help it to grow anew wherever you are, wherever you teach history. Thank you. A question?
What happens when people think the truth is partisan? How do you address it?
Well, this is why I really emphasize telling folks about the process of doing history, right? Of explaining primary and secondary sources, of trying to make clear that, contrary to what some may argue, this is not about an agenda per se, as simply trying to get in the archives, get to the documents, and show them, hey, this is what we're actually doing. This is what we're working with. This is why, again, teaching the tools of history to folks is so very important. Generations ago, a historian gave a talk at a conference back in the 1920s and 30s where he said, every person is a historian. Right? This idea that all of us, even if we're not classically trained in a PhD program or an MA program, we still have within us the ability to do some research, to learn, to actually process these things. But it's also worth noting, going back to your question, that even if you do all of that, there is no guarantee they won't say, well, that's still partisan. What you have to do, though, is hope that you can present these tools to the best of your abilities and say, this is what we're working with. We're not just throwing things within it. Yes.
We have one HBCU public college in South Carolina State University, right?
Yes.
Tell us how it came into being.
This is not a very popular story at Claflin. You'll see why in a second. So as I mentioned before, Claflin was the first HBCU in South Carolina. So after that, you have Allen and Benedict, so on and so forth. But in 1872, Claflin also has on its campus the creation of an agricultural mechanical institute. Claflin has always had this long history, like many HBCUs, of being torn between being a liberal arts institution and being more of an agricultural mechanical institute. By the mid-1890s, U.S. Congress has passed the Second Morrill Land Act, creating more land-grant institutions. The first iteration of that passed in the 1860s, creates what's now known as the Big Ten Universities in the Midwest. The second iteration creates a whole array of schools throughout the South, with the caveat that each southern state that received this funding had to create a school for white students and a school for black students. In South Carolina, it was decided to create the Black Land Grant Institution in Orangeburg, to basically take a piece of Claflin's campus away from Claflin and to create South Carolina State University. And so if you've not been to Orangeburg, not been to our campuses are so close to each other, there's literally just a fence between our two campuses. In fact, my building I work in, the James and Dorothy Elmore Chapel, is right next to that fence. I can walk out of my office, walk up the stairs, the fence is right there. In fact, security is so tight between the two campuses that there's a door in the fence that's often open. So I will sometimes walk across the fence and have lunch at NC State, that kind of thing. And I will demand our land back. But all jokes aside, your question is also really important, though, because the two schools have an intertwined history. In the 20th century, they both become centers of civil rights activism in Orangeburg. In fact, by the late 1950s, Claflin students began to call their university Freeland. Because you mentioned NC State being public, they were under constant threat from the state government of having their funding cut if students kept getting involved in activism in Orangeburg. So as we all know, college students are the least willing to listen to authority. So NC State students would simply cross the fence. They would go around the fence or find some other way to get to Claflin's campus. They would meet with Claflin students. Now, I read this story in Claflin's official history on a hilltop high that was released in 1984. And I thought, that almost sounds too good to be true. And then James Clyburn himself was at NC State a couple summers ago. You know, he was an NC State student, and he said the same thing. He said, yeah, we used to come to Claflin's campus, we called it Freeland. Yeah. So again, those two schools have such an interesting history of one being a liberal arts institution in Claflin, NC State having the A&M background, and they're still in Orangeburg and elsewhere. There's a lot of interactions with the two alumni bases. Yeah. Any other questions?
Dr. Greene, the concern I'm hearing from a lot of teachers about the pronouncement from the Department of Education about the bill that you can't make someone uncomfortable about history. And I was involved in learning myself that the instruction clause, the 14th Amendment that they charged Mr. Trump with for the January 6th thing, was used once before in South Carolina. And I tracked that down. And we now have the court hearings of the 900 people who were arrested in York County. And we got their names, and we got the very interesting court appearances and the arguments back and forth. And it sounds just like today. And so there were like 900 people, Klansmen, that were arrested for terrorizing people. And so maybe little Johnny's great-grandfather was a Klansman, but wouldn't little Johnny learn more? I mean, to me, the nonpartisan nature of history is the fact that 900 people were arrested, we didn't make that up, in York County for insurrection. But are people afraid to teach that now? And should we not be concerned about teaching the nonpartisan nature by simply like quoting the original documents like George Washington's farewell address when he denigrated the creation of parties? And if we talk about the United States being the only country, the only democratic country with a two-party system, that's crossing Ellen Weaver's line. And so I'm really wanting us to stress how we're certainly speaking the truth and talking about original documents. Is that not what we should lean on, and how do we bring that up and challenge it?
Well, I think certainly leaning on primary sources and original documents is a big part of this. But to the other part of your question, there is certainly a chill in the air across academia and
nervous?
I mean, well, I say this because I have friends who teach in states like Texas, where this has become a real serious challenge in terms of teaching at, say, Texas A&M, for instance. They're having to actually do something where they have to put their syllabi in the system, has to check everything, and it looks for things about race, gender, identity, etc. It's really, I mean, I know we use the term Orwellian too much, but I think that kind of sums it up. But I also think, again, going back to Cecil's question as well, the difficulty in teaching history in this era that we're living in right now is that everyone, it seems, is willing to question everything, but they're questioning everything in a way that is often not useful. And what I mean by that is they aren't using sources. They aren't using documents. They are simply saying that's wrong. And you say, well, why is it wrong? Because I said so. But why are you saying so? Because I said so that I said so. And so this back and forth is not conducive to learning. But I also, I think this speaks to some larger structural problems in our education system as well, in terms of how we emphasize teaching to an exam or teaching to a test as opposed to letting students be creative, letting them learn these things, really emphasizing that element of the process. Again, I mentioned before, most of my students at Claflin are from South Carolina. And many of my colleagues and I at Claflin talked about the fact that we can almost tell when a student is not from our state versus when they are. When they're not from our state, most of our students who are from outside of South Carolina are from Maryland, Virginia, the great migration corridor going up north to New York, or they're from places like Detroit, Philadelphia, and they're some of our best students. And I will talk to them about how they learn in their home schools elsewhere. And they'll talk to students from South Carolina, and the students from our home state are blown away by the resources they have, the kind of classes they have. And most of our students from South Carolina, they are not bad students. They are simply students who are figuring out for the first time in their lives, oh, I was deprived of all these things, not because of my teachers or administrators, it's just the whole state is just a poor state. And so, again, I think there is a real chill in the air on the one hand, but the thing that gives me hope is that I've met more people now, both at Claflin, the Modjeska School, just giving talks in public, more folks now than ever before who are genuinely interested in learning these histories. That's the good news. The bad news is that they are not yet organized. And so they have to kind of counter folks who are trying to suppress some of these histories, trying to control what we learn in the classroom. That's really where the rub is organizing the rest of the public. I would argue the majority who actually wants to at least have this history in their school.